Hello and welcome everybody to the Poker Fuse podcast. It's November 7th, 2019. This is episode number 32. I'm your host, Mike Gentili, along with my co-host, Nick Jones. This week on the podcast, Party Poker was unfortunately forced to cancel its highly ambitious Party Poker Million tournament last week after a technical issue resulted in not all players gaining entry into Day 2. But Party Poker committed over $500,000 to compensate players and plans to run another this Sunday. After months of waiting, PokerStars has finally launched in the state of Pennsylvania, becoming the first operator to spread online poker in the Keystone State. And while it's early days still, all signs point to a successful venture for the world's biggest online poker operator. And finally, third quarter financial results are out, and it doesn't make for easy reading among the world's biggest online poker operators. We take a look at the financial results of the parent companies of PokerStars, Party Poker, and Unibet.
So I think it was the last time we recorded this podcast, we talked about the then upcoming Party Poker Million, a fairly audacious attempt by Party Poker to run a $1 million guaranteed Sunday tournament every week. That first inaugural tournament was meant to run last Sunday. Unfortunately, things didn't quite go to plan.
Yeah, so there was a bit of a hiccup. On Day 1D, which was the final flight, those players that were able to make it to Day 2 were not able to actually get seated in the tournament for Day 2.
Yeah.
So they did have to eventually pause it and eventually cancel it. But with the hiccups also came an opportunity for the operator to, I guess, show what they're made of. And they did do that quite well.
Yeah, so as you explained there, Mike, they had 4 Day 1 flights. Ultimately, the last one started just 6 hours, I think, before the Day 2, which is the final day. So the final Day 1D flight, which was a turbo event, and got like 1,800 entries, so almost as much as all the other days combined, which they needed because they were facing a pretty hefty overlay. But they got 1,800 players. It's still they still had an overlay, so that's worth pointing out. In addition to all the extra money that they gave back to players, the concessions they gave, which we'll get to, the tournament did have a $150,000 overlay. So which I think is probably what Party Poker expected. You know, this was a very high target to set. They would have collected, without the fees, the overlay was more like 70,000, and they would have collected fees through the satellites and that kind of thing. So that was probably acceptable to them. But yeah, so Day 1D, they got a lot of players in seats, and then unfortunately, Day 1D players did not gain entry into the Day 2 tournament.
So a $150,000 overlay. Just to give that some context, how does that relate to other big overlays that we've seen perhaps in other big series?
It's big. Like, I can't think the last time PokerStars had like a 6-figure overlay. Yes, so they just ran their Bounty Builder tournament series, and that had it paid out like 35 million in total. I think it was 25 million guaranteed. That had some overlays. It might have totaled 6 figures across the whole series. But for a single tournament, it's quite large. Over 10% is quite rare. Party Poker probably can't shoulder that every week. But I think for a tournament,
but it's also a good marketing opportunity.
That's it. And I think if you also get players playing your other Sunday tournaments, you get them playing throughout the week as well. And something that's really nicely structured about this is they have the Day 1A for next week running at the same time you're playing Day 2 of that current week. So people can, they get through to that Day 2 and they can start their journeys again for next week as well. So that's actually really smart. I'm not sure if I've seen anyone structure it that way before. And obviously, as it goes on, once you've done 1 week smoothly, you're going to generate more people into the next week. Those people in Day 2 are going to start playing next week's as well. So it was starting on the back foot there. There wasn't a lot of ramp up or promotion to this event from what I could tell. So I think beyond the massive technical issue they had, I think they probably would have been pretty pleased with how that first week had gone and with that level of overlay. As I say, so day 2 started, and the people that qualified through day 1D, I think it was about 400 players, 404 players, something like that, didn't make it through to day 2. They couldn't sit and enter the tournament. So Party Poker noticed this immediately and tried to pause the tournament so they could restart it, but they couldn't pause it due to a second technical issue that they had. They didn't manage to pause it for, I think, 2 hours. So this day 2 played with only half the number of people that should have been in it. Loads of people got knocked out, and I think if you made day 2, you made the money. So a lot of these people were paid out money, totaling $400,000 was paid out to people who got knocked out of that day 2, who were only facing a field half the size they should have done. So Party Poker is in a really tricky spot there, because you've got people who've invested 2 hours playing day 2 who feel like, okay, I've accumulated a big stack, that should be worth something. There's people who were knocked out on day 2 who were paid out prize money. And then, of course, there's all the people who didn't make it, who should have taken their seats and couldn't. So Party Poker very quickly, so this all happened at like 7 p.m. on Sunday. By 9 p.m. They had decided what they were going to do in what was a fairly tricky spot, and probably not made everybody happy, but have paid a lot of money out of pocket to make a lot of people pretty happy.
Yeah, so what I saw on social and in the forums and such was that most players were pretty pleased with the way that Party Poker went about trying to make good for the players. There was a lot of details behind the compensation. There were a lot of players in a lot of different circumstances. There are those that got knocked out in day 2. There were those who were supposed to make day 2 that didn't make day 2. There were those that had big stacks and made day 2. So there was a lot of different nuances to making this compensation. And it seemed like most people were pretty happy. I don't know. There's a lot of subsections of players in different circumstances. Do you have the details behind how each of those groups were compensated?
Yeah, and it took me a while to work out exactly how it was happening. But broadly, so the $1 million guarantee, which included the overlay, that was obviously honoured, and that was distributed to everybody who made it through to day 2, whether they could take their seat or not. And 50% was split evenly amongst all players. Then the other 50% was based on chip stack, I presume at the start of day 2. So that was how the $1 million was distributed, which I think is probably fairly standard. Again, for people who play day 2 and accumulated chips, they would be a little bit miffed at that, but this is often how these things are dealt with. But then in addition to that, so beyond that $1 million, everyone who was playing day 2 when the tournament was paused was given the next pay spot, which I think was like $1,600. They were given that in addition. Everybody who'd been busted out of day 2 and they had received a payout, that money was honoured, even though the tournament was ultimately cancelled. And then
question. That money that was paid out, that they were compensated for, then that was in addition to the 50% that they would get from the guarantee and the other 50% based on chip stack?
Yeah, I believe so. So the $1 million was distributed to everyone who made it through to day 2. Plus, on top of that, everyone who received a payout for playing day 2 and busted kept that. In addition, everyone who remained got the next pay spot. And so, we're already at something like $450,000, I think, paid out. And then on top of that, everybody who was affected, so everyone who made day 2, that's, I think, 806 players, all received another $215 ticket to play a future Party Poker Million event. So all on top, it was something like $600,000 in compensation that they gave back to players, in addition to the overlay, which they honoured in the $1 million prize pool, which was paid out. So a huge chunk of change.
Yeah, regardless of the circumstances of any individual player, it's hard for someone to point at them and say that they didn't treat players fairly. Just listening to the list of things that you rattled off there, a lot of that seemed over and above, or above and beyond what they would be expected to do.
Yeah, and just to read what Rob Young put on Twitter soon afterwards, tonight we have the worst possible thing that ever could happen on the site, was how he classified it. So yeah, and that happened. It was a complete mess, and they very quickly decided to try and turn it into a big positive. And as you say, like I can't think of another time that an operator has made such a call and that kind of payout. The only thing that comes to mind is PokerStars had a $1.2 million overlay in a tournament a year or two back, but I mean that was you have to pay that out. You've got a guaranteed tournament. I mean, I suppose you can cancel it if you see that overlay coming and annoy a lot of people, but that's the only thing that's in that order of magnitude where I think that if we include the overlay, we're looking more like $750,000, $750,000 paid out by PokerStars, by Party Poker. So so that was week 1 of the Party Poker Million. We are, of course, recording this on Thursday. We are halfway into week 2 of the Party Poker Million. This thing will run again with the same structure this Sunday, and they've already had the first day ones running.
Right. So how can they be sure that they have this problem fixed? Are they confident that they're going to be able to take players from day 1D and have them feed into day 2?
I hope so.
Yeah, because if that were to happen again, it's hard to imagine that they would be able to do anything less than they did the first time around, and that could be quite costly.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like my gut is, and this is just based on how I think these things would have gone. I imagine it was the day 1D there was a deployment error, so it wasn't correctly set up to feed into day 2. Obviously they've run multi-day tournaments all the time, so they obviously have the capacity. So unless there was some weird glitch, I would imagine that day 1D was set up and didn't correctly feed in. When that was spotted, I think that's when the technical errors hit, and they either couldn't correct that problem, and we know that they couldn't pause the tournament. And I think I read it might have been on social media that they did manage to cancel it, but it was still in the lobby due to some some lag or delay. So yeah, obviously they're proceeding. They're not putting pause to the whole concept. And say they've run multi-day events before, so presumably they're confident this time that it'll work.
Yeah, maybe the actual inability to pause the tournament is actually the bigger issue, because like you say, they have run multi-flight tournaments before, so the feeding from day 1D into day 2 could have just been maybe somebody didn't check a particular box, but not being able to pause the tournament, that seems like it could be a bigger issue.
Yes, and maybe that is a problem that they have fixed or are looking to fix, because it definitely seems like an ability that you want. Yeah. So what we can see so far is that the turnout so far is about the same as the first week, so probably a bit lower than they would want to see. So we've only had day 1, A and B at the time of recording. They've had about 1,500 people take their seats. They need 5,000. With that said, day 1D is going to be huge. And the thing is, there are 800 or so people who have now got Party Poker Million tickets. So although they won't have had that nice overlap effect again, because they had these technical problems, so I imagine a lot of people didn't play day 1A because they are probably so annoyed of day 2 being cancelled. So that only got about 600 runners. Day 1B did better than the day 1B the week prior. Obviously they'll be looking for a good turnout tonight, which is their day 1C, but I think day 1D is where they could see over a couple of thousand people. So yeah, fingers crossed they get a few more players in seats for this week. And it's worth pointing out, they also have the micro and mini versions of this tournament, which has a $200,000 and $20,000 buy-in for guarantee for a buy-in of $22 or $2, I think. They suffered the same technical problems in week 1 as well, and there was the same compensation payout in these tournaments.
All right, so I've got a question for you. I hope I don't catch you off guard or unprepared, but we had talked about this tournament when it was first announced, and we had talked about how this could affect the overall landscape of Sunday tournaments, Sunday majors. And, I'm curious as to, did we see any big change on how the PokerStars Sunday Million reacted since this ran?
Well, we did notice a change. It was a very good week for PokerStars Sunday Million.
So it was an additive effect. Very cool.
Well, it's hard to say after 1 week. Maybe a lot of people were just planning to play the party poker one, and because of the problems, they then played the Sunday Million. Maybe there was the additive effect that people played both. There are also just a lot of factors at the PokerStars side of things. They had been running the Bounty Builder series for the prior 3 weekends. Prior to that, they had a lot of PKs. But we saw a healthy turnout, probably the healthiest we've seen since the other side of summer for a completely straight, non-progressive knockout Sunday Million. We are going into the higher part of the season, but there was definitely a noticeable bump. I think this Sunday and going forward, it'll be interesting to see how numbers are impacted.
In what must have seemed like an eternity for people in Pennsylvania, online poker is finally back up and running in the Keystone State. On Monday this week, PokerStars soft launched their online poker room starting at 2 o'clock, and that soft launch period lasted until 10 p.m. And then again on Tuesday, they had a 2 p.m. start that lasted until midnight this time, with the site going fully live on Wednesday just after 11 a.m. It was quite a celebratory mood all over social media and in the poker forums. Everyone seemed very happy to get back to the online tables.
Yeah, so at the time that we're recording this, PokerStars has not done a full 24-hour period of play yet. So we had the soft launch windows Monday, Tuesday, and then it came online for a full launch. Again, I think around 2 p.m. local time on Wednesday. So today, when, by the time this goes out, they would have had their first full day. But, all signs point to a lot of people jumping through the hoops to sign up and deposit and play on PokerStars Pennsylvania.
Yes, there were a lot of butts in seats for sure, but that didn't come so easily. There were a few hiccups, but, well, not really a few hiccups. There was really just one. And it was more of a hiccup from the side of the operator than the regulator. And the regulator is absolutely the one that deems whether or not the soft launch was a success and whether or not they allow PokerStars to go forward with a full launch. And they did. So from their aspect, it wasn't really a hiccup. But from the operator, they had a little bit of trouble getting their download of their client out to the players because players were being directed to a URL that was redirecting them to a Play Money client, and it wasn't so easy to get the Real Money client up and running and get into the actual seats.
Yeah, there was, and maybe things would have been clearer by the time this podcast goes out, but there's still question marks in my mind that I'm not quite sure PokerStars' primary domain, because they promoted this new PokerStars.bet URL, which is what went out in the press release, the media stuff ahead of time, and on the PokerStars blog as well. And it was, to sign up and play, go to PokerStars.bet. But it seems PokerStars.bet is very clearly the PokerStars.net equivalent for, I guess, the US markets. It's difficult because obviously depending on what location you see different sites, and I think that led to a lot of confusion about people writing this and excitedly sharing links and stuff. Is what so for me, PokerStars.bet works. I'm not redirected, but I see the .net client for the UK market, and I think they had a bug in there that even if you're in Pennsylvania, you got the .net download client for the New Jersey thing, which caused issues. But the bigger picture was that that's the .net site, and if you want to play for real money, the URL is this PokerStarsMountairy.com URL, which is, I think, their primary one they use because the domain has to have their partner's name in the domain.
Yeah, that's part of the regulation. And I don't have official word from PokerStars on this, but it's, looking at how things transpired, it's my assessment that they're trying to use this PokerStars.bet domain for everybody to have, so that it's geolocated based on the location of the player. And when they go to that, it redirects them to the required URL, in this case, PokerStars Mount Airy, or exactly whatever it is. I don't have it in front of me. But what then will happen is it will feed them the correct download client, and at the same time it satisfies the requirement of the regulation, which requires you to have your land-based casino partner as part of the URL. But I don't think there's a restriction in the regulations that says you can't have multiple URLs. So what they're trying to do, it looks like, is have PokerStars.net redirect to the required URL, because it's probably a lot easier to market or for someone to remember PokerStars.bet than to have to remember a URL that has requirements of the regulation built into it.
Yeah. And so despite all that confusion, hundreds of players, managed to work it out and, get downloaded, get signed up, get any geolocation issues sorted, get deposited, and play real money poker. So people were feverishly monitoring the lobby for play accounts, and saw, I think, by the day 2 soft launch window, well over 1,000 people were sat down and playing. Now that number does include play money players, the one reported in the lobby, but there were very few play money tables going. So we are talking about, definitely hundreds of individuals sat down at over 1,000 seats at the cash game tables during a soft launch window where there was no promotion and the URL nobody really understood. So, pretty strong demonstration of the pent-up demand for online poker in a US state.
Yeah, so before we sat down to record this, I pulled up Anuj's article that he wrote on the results of the soft launch, and I pulled some traffic figures from there, and this is what I've got. Day 1 of the soft launch, which was an 8-hour period, the peak of players at the tables, or seats filled, I should say, was around 750. There were also 12 MTTs that ran on the first day, and 3 of them that actually had guarantees. Initially, as they were rolled out, none of the MTTs had guarantees, but I think they added them as the day progressed. There was 12,000 K in prize money awarded, and a total of 1,341 entries in tournaments for the first day. So that sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
And then concurrent cash game players, according to Game Intel, peaked at 573.
Yeah. So we're starting to get now data from Game Intel, which formerly PokerScout, which tracks the average concurrent players at cash game tables. And we have the data now in the Pro Data platform if you are a subscriber to Poker Industry Pro. And so just looking at these numbers now, so for Wednesday, the average so we've only got 3 data points, obviously, but they're averaging around 370 concurrent players. That, interesting tidbit, is more than all other US regulated sites combined. So WSOP 888, which spans 3 states, is around the 200 concurrent players mark, and then PokerStars in New Jersey is around the 70-80 mark. And yeah, I mean, the Borgata Party Poker network is much, much smaller. So now it's definitely worth saying that, again, these are windows during peak times, so their average concurrency is going to be higher because they're not open during 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. or probably even worse 8 a.m. So again, these numbers will decline, but it will be surprising from this if PokerStars did not sit on top of a ranking of all US regulated sites, despite being in just one state compared with the WSOP, which is across 3.
So beyond how they compare to the US, so just as a point of reference, the population of Pennsylvania is about equal to the other 3 states that have legal online poker combined. So that would be New Jersey, Nevada, and Delaware. But how does traffic that we've seen so far, how does that compare outside of the U.S.? Do we have any other markets that we can look at to say if this is a success or if it's average or below average?
Yeah, so, and again, I hazard to draw too many conclusions from these kind of partial numbers. So in a podcast in a week's time, I think we'll get some better numbers. But very roughly speaking, when you're in that, 300 concurrent players mark, 350, Unibet is around that size, it's estimated. So sites like Party Poker in Europe, so their segregated market in France and Spain is around that size. MPN is around that size. To compare, something like 888 Poker is around 900 seats, so about 3 times larger.
Wow, and that's the global.com market, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's encouraging to start, for sure. They did receive some propping up from some of the promotions that they did to begin with. They had a $600 first deposit match bonus, which is pretty standard. And then I think they also had, what was it? Oh, $30 free in bonus money that they were giving to people that created a new account.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, $30 free play, which I think is their standard for markets, but it definitely encourages players to get in there.
Yeah, there were also the free rolls that they ran. In total, there was $30,000 given away as prizes in free entry tournaments over the course of the first week to 10 days. So, while there's a lot of this pent-up desire in Pennsylvania to get back to the tables, there wasn't a big, huge promotional push to get all these people to the tables during the soft launch period. And for me, that's encouraging, because that leaves a lot of room to grow. And especially when we're looking at, coming up on the high season for online poker, I think we could see a pretty significant increase in traffic in Pennsylvania in the not too near future.
Yeah, and in fact, their launch promotions, so the free rolls you mentioned, I think the first one is today, the 7th, and they run for like 10 days from today, and they culminate into, I think of those $30,000, I think 20,000 is one final free roll in 10 days' time. And so, like, really, yeah, as you say, they probably required not to really promote it during a soft launch window. That's not really the idea. They just want to get through the regulatory red tape before doing anything. So at this point today is really when they're going to start doing anything. And you're absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, numbers should absolutely increase once, the domains get sorted and more PR goes out and more sites get promoting and the promotions get going. We would expect it to continue to climb from here. And as you say, going into the peak season only helps traffic numbers. Things don't really peak for 2 or 3 months from here. So and we would expect the global market to be growing regardless.
Yeah, and I expect that the success by PokerStars in Pennsylvania could actually light a fire under some of the other operators, to get them to recognize that, hey, maybe they want to get in on the action of online poker in Pennsylvania. Because, once online sports betting, or once sports betting in general, was legalized, a lot of the operators started to focus their effort on this new shiny object because of the potential and the revenue that it has to bring in. And even online casinos generate more revenue for the operators than poker usually does. So, poker kind of seemed like it got knocked down a few pegs and maybe wasn't the highest priority. But now that we're seeing a success here in Pennsylvania, and then the potential to combine player pools in the future, maybe other operators are taking notice of what PokerStars is doing, and maybe that could help get them to market a little bit sooner.
So we're pretty much coming to the end of the third quarter financial season. So we have the financial results from the world's large online gaming companies and from the world's largest online poker companies. And so while during the interim quarters we don't get financial results from some of the UK companies, which only report on an annual or half annual basis, we do get some data. So we have Q3 results today from the Stars Group. We have a small trading update from GVC, which touched on poker a couple of weeks ago, and we have data from the Kindred Group. So Mike, which would you like to dive into first?
Let's start with Kindred. So Kindred is Unibet for poker, and just thinking back, I don't remember a lot of huge stories, good or bad, coming out of Kindred or Unibet. So I suspect that their Q3 reporting will be more true to their performance.
Well, definitely Kindred is the shining example of the three. They had a very good Q3 in terms of online poker, and in fact, it was very good when set against the backdrop of their company as a whole, which has suffered a great deal with operations in Sweden, and I think I'm seeing if I got the data here for their company as a whole. It was either flat or declining. Both casino and sports betting declined year over year. and yet poker continued to grow. So poker was up 18% year over year. It was its second biggest quarter on record, generated
18%.
Yeah. I mean, they have been at that level. Let's just check. I think this is like, 10 quarters, 8 quarters of consistent growth, and often in the 10, 20, even 30% area. So, and it's we've seen this growth before, but the whole company has been lifted. And when that happens, you can just argue that Unibet Poker has done a good job of offering poker to their casino and sports betting customers. So obviously Kindred Group is sports and casino about equally, is almost entirely their business. Poker makes up like 2%. So we're talking a very small share of the company's overall interests. And so if poker goes up 20%, but so does casino and sport, then you can say, okay, poker provided a good service to their customers, but maybe it's not bringing in new customers, generating extra revenue. But when casino and sports declines and poker still grows 20% year over year, it really seems a clear sign to me that it is managing to sustain itself as a business and attract new poker first customers directly into their platform.
Wow. So correct me if I'm wrong. Traditionally, poker is the player acquisition tool for other iGaming like casino and sports. Well, I think sports, but to have those two verticals decline or be flat is surprising. So maybe they're cross-selling the other way, or maybe their cross-sell to casinos not performing as well as it could.
I think it depends on a company-to-company basis. Definitely, for the Stars Group, for GVC, for other companies, they talk about poker being this good, low-cost acquisition channel to bring customers into the brand, and then they can be cross-sold into, the higher yield casino side. Sports betting can often be a cheap customer acquisition channel, and they can also be cross-sold into casino. The theory being that a lot of customers want to bet on sports, want to play poker as a default. They need to be sold on playing in casinos. So they're good ways of bringing people in. I think Kindred Group has always just brought people directly into sports betting, and that's always been their business. Poker has been something they offer on the side to keep customers who want to play a bit of poker on brand and on the site, but has never really been a particularly meaningful part of the business. 5 years ago, they embarked on relaunching their online poker product because they didn't want to remain on a network. They wanted to try and do something different. And what these numbers show is that strategy has been very successful. And I think they are bringing in, poker first customers potentially for the first time. And long term, that should help provide a secondary funnel for players coming into the Unibet brand. It's only really getting started. It's still very small, so it's still much smaller than obviously PokerStars. It's still 30 to 50% of the business, depending on which part you look at. Even with Party Poker, it's 10% plus. I think this is still very, very small, but is sustaining itself and growing.
Yeah, and when you have those smaller numbers, it's a lot easier to grow at higher percentages. But either way, kudos to Kindred and to Unibet Poker. It's quite a performance.
Yeah, and that's probably a good transition point to discuss the Stars Group. So their results only came out today. It's very similar reading to what we've seen the previous 2 quarters, which is online poker, looking at the PokerStars business, their international side of the business, continues to decline at around about the 10% mark year over year. It's been like that all year. 2019 is definitely looking like it could be the lowest in 5 years, offsetting gains that it made in 2018 and 2017. So this is returning back to kind of 2016 levels. Now the reasons for that that they give are they do face some regulatory headwinds, Russia in particular, although that wasn't mentioned in the presentation and the press release today. The withdrawal from Switzerland was the one thing highlighted. They withdrew in July, so this was the first full quarter where they weren't present, or almost full quarter where they weren't present in Switzerland, and they're still looking to return to that market. So that took the brunt of kind of the blame, plus currency fluctuations. But the big thing with the Stars Group and why overall, growth is even if it's not negative as it has been this year, is fairly flat, and that's because they were a poker only company a few years ago, and they've launched a casino and sports betting business, and so those have been traditionally growing substantially whilst trying to maintain roughly flat. So cross-selling poker customers into the casino and to a lesser extent the sportsbook. So perhaps the more concerning part of the Stars Group's revenue is that the casino and sportsbook are also suffering.
Ah, all right. So, they point to Switzerland. We know that Russia's been a challenge for a little while. And I'm wondering, is this all just corporate speak or investor talk based? I don't know, Nick. What do you think? What's your professional opinion? What's leading to this decline? Is this a deteriorating image in front of the poker community? Is it, regulatory challenges? Is it more focus on other verticals such as casino and sports? What do you think it is?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of factors, isn't there? I mean, I don't think it's all just investors talk that they face issues in disrupted markets and closed markets. I mean, they break the numbers out in presentation slides. They show that in their kind of established regulated markets, there's growth. So you can just focus on that and go, okay, underlying there is still this demand for poker that is growing by small percentage points. But the issue is that the business has always been operating in markets that aren't fully regulated, so you can't just exclude them. And definitely, the business is shifting more and more to regulated markets. They bring their own costs as well. But I think the main point is I don't foresee an area where PokerStars will be 100% regulated. So it's always going to be part of the business. Cross-sell is always going to have its hit when you just look at poker. From the high level, they just want to look at the overall wallet spend of an individual customer, and if they're spending more in the casino and that is slightly offset by loss in poker, that's not really a problem to them. Poker is still massive. Even though we're talking about declining figures, it still generates $200 million in revenue last quarter. The year won't be too shy of $1 billion for the year. It's still amazingly cash generative, revenue generative business that is seeing some declines in the face of some increased competition, I imagine, and their regulatory pressures. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of things in the bucket there to explain it. I think maybe the concern is they saw a fall in betting revenue from their international business. I think I'm just looking here. I think the casino actually did quite good, quite well. I'm just reading what I wrote today about it. There was slight growth in casino. Overall, the international business did decline at just under 8%. So yeah, I mean. Business.
So, just to recap, the decline was how much? 8%?
8% across their international business segment. So that excludes the UK, Sky Betting and Gaming, and their Australia business, yeah.
Okay, and you had mentioned that currency fluctuations were part of that. So, on a constant currency basis, do we know what that decline was?
Yeah, so constant currency basis, the decline was more like 4% across the international segment. Poker was 8%. So, poker is not, significantly out of line of the rest of the business here.
Okay, well, that's encouraging.
It's affected slightly more than the other businesses. They do point to, they're still confident in 2020 poker will return to small single-digit growth. They talked about lots of more products in the pipeline that will help grow. They talked about how they've got the PSPC coming up next year. They had a big W coup, these kinds of things. So they've got ideas in the pipeline. They do expect things to return to growth. They will definitely start lapping some of these headwinds at some point. So Russia, they've been facing issues there for a year now. So you would think at least come Q4, Q1 2020, they will have a full year on the books of struggling with these difficulties, which makes annual comparisons much more favourable, look much more rosy.
All right, so they're looking at new product development and the PSPC as the two major things to drive them and get them back on track in 2020?
Yeah, and the reality is that poker and PokerStars is just talked about a lot less in these. Well, I was going to say earnings call. There actually wasn't one today, and they've stopped them pending the Flutter merger. But they still put together presentation slides for no one to present, which I find a little bit obscure. But in these presentation slides, PokerStars now might get one box where and 3 bullet points, where you go back 3 years and it was 12 slides, because not only do they have to talk about PokerStars Casino and BetStars, but of course they've got Sky Betting and Gaming, and they've got 3 separate Australia businesses, and now of course they're talking about merging with Flutter. So just the amount of time spent on talking about PokerStars is much slimmer. So gleaning their future plans is less fruitful, I think, diving into these financials as it once was.
Yeah, I think putting out the presentation without having someone to present it, the first thing that comes to my mind is they don't have to answer questions. So that could be the strategy, but who knows? I'm curious though, did they mention the U.S. at all as any kind of factor in as potential to get things back on track? Especially seeing the success of the launch in Pennsylvania. I'm curious if that was mentioned.
Yeah, so just to your first point, I think presumably this is standard regulatory practice that, as you say, avoids answering questions, but maybe you can't answer questions when these things are pending. I mean, they didn't put pause to it during the Sky Betting and Gaming acquisition, but I won't pretend to fully understand exactly when these disclosures must be made and in what format. So I assume this kind of all legit and how things are done. It just surprises me. On the US front, yeah, I mean, again, things were highlighted. The Fox Bet launch was successful. They mentioned we'd just gone live for online poker in Pennsylvania. So they squeezed that in. But it's very costly running here, so it's going to add a bit to revenue. But it's nothing compared with, you look at the engine that Sky Bet has in the UK, that PokerStars has. We're talking, the figures are so large that the US market is never going to be more than a blip for the short term, at least. So from my glance through it today, and I did only skim it only came out a few hours ago, there wasn't any grand proclamations. Again, the business next step is this merger with Flutter, and it's going to transform everything they do. They're going to have Betfair, they're going to have Paddy Power, they're going to have FanDuel, right? This could be a very different company that we're talking about in a year's time. So that seems to be what the next steps for the business is.
Okay, well then that leaves GVC, right?
Yeah, so let's just do GVC very quickly. GVC was an odd one. So GVC at Party Poker, for a start, they don't really report Party Poker numbers directly. They don't give direct revenue figures, but they always allude to percentage gains over time, so we can make some extrapolations. In Q3, they didn't talk about it. They didn't give a percentage for poker overall, but it did decline. So we know that it did decline. That has bucked a trend of revenues going up for, 8 quarters, something like that, maybe even more. The reason why it declined, this is where things get interesting. The reason why it declined is, they said explicitly, is because of bots that they have removed from the Party Poker network this year has impacted revenue.
Okay, so poker is down for the first time in 8 quarters, according to GVC. And they attribute that in large part to the removal of these bots from their network. Is that correct? Do I understand that?
Yeah, that is correct. So I'm just trying to bring up the numbers that we have got. Is that so? Party Poker sits in a portfolio of brands called the Games label, and that let's see, fell. I only wrote about it. This is 2 or 3 weeks old, so that's why it's not super fresh in my mind. So it grew 8%, but poker declined. It would have been more, except for the loss of poker. The one quote is, "We've cleaned up the ecology of the cash rooms on the Party Poker business. This was mainly as a result of giving cash games a bigger push." I think he just means focus there. This is the CEO talking. Yeah, I mean, so in fact, it's not even super clear that it definitely declined, but I think it probably did, and that would be the first time. So what we have seen is that we've seen that the percentages of growth. So again, they've enjoyed 30, 40, 50% growth over the last couple of years. This year, that growth has slowed to more like 10 to 15%. And then probably last quarter, it might have even been flat or declined. And that is in line with when they started this bot clampdown, which started in really December of last year. So it is the last 3 quarters that they would have seen this impact. So it does make sense from that side of things.
Okay, so I'm not sure if you have this information up in front of you, but what's the trend looking like for their catching these bots and refunding money to players? Because I'm going to assume that the success there is going to impact the results for the next quarter.
Well, yeah, so there's a couple of things there. Like we talked about the Stars group, is that they will they will lap the start of this impact in Q4 and definitely in Q1. So even if they, continue doing it, they removed a lot of bots. I think their first month last December was like they redistributed like $500,000, I want to say, in that very first month. They caught some huge accounts and refunded it. That's going to have an overnight big impact on
so year over year,
these bots. And so when we get to year over year, it's going to be it's going to look a lot better. So they kind of will weather that by Q4 or Q1 2020. But the numbers have declined. I think last month was much less confiscated, much fewer accounts discovered, and so they point to that and say we've done the job of cleaning up our games. These bot operators have moved on to other networks or stopped their activity. So yeah, it feels like from what we're seeing the last couple of months that the job could be kind of done. They've removed a lot of players who were generating rake at the tables.
So do we have a sense for just how clean the network is? I mean, is this reduction a matter of them not catching it anymore, or is this them saying, hey, we've rooted out a lot of these bots from the network and this is a clean place to play and better than other online poker rooms that haven't done this work?
I mean, it's hard to say, isn't it? They would definitely say the second one. There's no reason to suggest it's the first, but this is the problem with these numbers. We've talked about that on the podcast a lot before, as these numbers can be interpreted in almost directly opposite ways. It could be, as you say, that they have, taken their foot off the gas of catching bots, and that's why there are less there. But that's not what they're saying. What they're saying is that we're finding less. We see on like these bot forums how people are recommending not to play on Party Poker anymore because your accounts get caught and that kind of thing. The accounts they do close have got less money in them. It definitely seems that the amount that they confiscated from some bot accounts, these bot operators had got very lax in taking money off the site. They were sitting there with accounts with tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars in, doing their thing and feeling like there would be no repercussions. And that definitely seems to have changed. Maybe some are still operating. They're still catching accounts every month. They're still reporting those numbers. But and it's hard. I certainly haven't seen players saying like, the games are still, infested with bots, that kind of thing. That's definitely not chatter that I read. So I think we have to take them on at their word when they say that they've made this investment to their integrity team to cleaning up the games, and it has had a material impact on the revenue we generated in the last year because of it.
Yeah, and so I remember there was some talk before about how exactly they were catching these bots, and they attributed a lot of their success to their internal team, and less so to players' tips. Do they report the source of how they caught these bots? I don't remember.
No, so they don't do that. They haven't done that since I think April of this year, when they put a stop to HUDs and hand histories.
Okay, so it looks like we're going to see, even if it's just because of the year-over-year numbers and the lapping of the difficulties that have been faced, as you mentioned, it looks like we're going to see some better numbers in 2020 from the major online poker operators. How would you say the revenue figures overall from these major companies? What do you think that says about the landscape of the online poker industry?
So it's definitely going to be pretty brutal year for 2018 across the industry. There's going to be few bright spots. You know, at the end of last year and the report that we wrote, you know, poker had performed, you know, pretty robustly considering the headwinds that it had faced. Most operators had reported growing revenue, growing customer activity, had a lot of development underway. This year is not going to be that. I mean, we are going to see party pokers, you know, poker growth will be a lot less than before. The Stars groups will be down double digits. Kindred will be doing well, but still very small. 888s is, I don't think, will stop its declines unless, you know, there's a huge change that we see in their approach to the product. You know, on the bright spot, you'd think like in 2020, there's nothing really in the short term to mid-term that I would see would be another major impact, another significant headwind that operators will have to face. You know, we do have Netherlands regulation coming up that should have a positive effect. That should be beneficial. There is, you know, the UK could cause further regulatory headaches for some customers. That's a potential negative. But in theory, with the US markets growing, with potentially more European shared liquidity, with things like Sweden settling down a bit, with the Netherlands, you know, there are more, you know, bright spots than dark ones. And again, like with a lot of operators lapping pretty horrendous 2019s, you know, hopefully we'll see some and customers are continuing to invest. Operators are continuing to invest as well. This is the thing. Like, we're not hearing that people are just taking their foot off the gas and throwing in the towel. You know, party poker continuing running $1 million guaranteed tournaments, even though if it costs them $500,000 in technical problems. PokerStars has got a huge slate of new games coming out, another PSPC. They're being more targeted in how they spend their money, but they, you know, still have a strong team behind them investing. Unibet still doing their thing. iPoke still trying to, you know, fight their corner. 888 perhaps the only one that we still have yet to see kind of really, I don't know, put their fists up and get involved. But, you know, that's all still happening. So, you know, I would like to see 2020 Q1 numbers getting off to a much better start. Yeah, next year.
Well, that wraps up this episode of the Poker Fuse podcast. As a reminder, please give us a like and a subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also follow us and interact with us on Twitter. Nick is at PokerProJones. I'm at SpookyBugs. Thanks everyone for tuning in.